Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss on development and dependency. Now, it is very important to understand theories of development in order to make sense of how this discourse on development has taken place in sociology. So, when we kind of understand development, we know that it has been understood more or less in terms of evaluative outcomes. That is, it has been kind of countries had been evaluated in terms of whether progress and change has taken place. One of the theory which is very significant to understand development was modernization theory. Now, modernization theory argued that it was very important for societies to modernize and modernize on the basis of the model presented by the Western society. Now, the modernization perspective was actually the result of the Western world led by America to help developing countries to overcome mass poverty. Now, when we look into the dependency theory, we will kind of understand that the status of underdevelopment was not internal as argued by the modernization theory, but it was the result of the colonial rule, because most of the countries which were labeled or put into the category of underdeveloped and developing were countries that had experienced colonization. So the modernization theory, they were kind of using certain indicators, and these indicators more or less in order to measure structural change were economic. So in order to measure the GDP of the country or the capital formation of the country, and therefore those which had lower capital formation, low GDP were ranked as underdeveloped. So theories of modernization school by the 90s started failing to understand that development is not only an internal, but it was also in terms of external and historical factors which resulted in the underdevelopment of third world country. And this led birth to the dependency theory of development. So in this part of the lecture, we are going to discuss the dependency theory. Now, if we were to understand the genesis of dependency theory, we see that the school of dependency emerged in Latin America from the beginning of 1950s to the half of 1970s. Now, when we compare the modernization theory with the dependency theory, it is completely opposed to the modernization. Rather, the dependency theory emerges as a critique to the modernization theory. So, the modernization theory were kind of the outcome of the thinking of certain intellectuals. It was an approach from top, thinking of intellectual largely belonging to the developed countries, and they were framing models or they were framing theories for the development of the countries which were in the third world. So, modernization studies saw development from the point of view of the Westerners, that is, the North versus the South. The North economy or the process of development was considered as complete, or it was considered as a better model compared to the East, and the East was supposed to kind of follow that model. So, the dependency school was completely opposed to the modernization theory, and the modernization theory was framed, as I said, from the academia, from the intellectual. Dependency theory is actually giving voice to the periphery. It is coming in from the marginalized or those who have been subject to the level of underdevelopment, and because of underdevelopment there are certain level of social, economic and other problem. So the theory of dependency, which kind of is also known as the voice from the periphery. They speak of underdevelopment of the third world rather than the lack of development. So modernization theory was saying that these underdeveloped countries are actually lacking development. They have certain internal factors which could be the status of a technology, the type of economy, the social cultural practices, whereas the dependency theory is arguing that the level of underdevelopment is also the outcome of external forces coming and interfering with the nations. So basically the argument of the dependency is to kind of point at the colonial rule which kind of led to the underdevelopment of these nations. So the cause of underdevelopment is not internal but external. And the order which produces the two worlds, is the kind of the world, which is the Western world or the developed world or the industrialized society, versus underdeveloped third world or the kind of society which are largely in Latin America, Africa and Asia. Dependency theory is a model of economic and social development, whereas the modernization theory is basically on the economic aspect. Dependency theory would explain global inequality in terms of historical exploitation of the poor nations by the rich ones. They assert that people living in poor countries were actually better off economically in the past than the descendants are now. And one of the main proponent of dependency theory was Andre Gunder Frank. And he was kind of arguing that the colonial process in itself was a system that kind of helped or kind of aided the rich country nations to become more rich, to become more developed, and they were doing it at the cost of the colonized country, which was then going on, getting more underdeveloped and getting it economically poor. The second reason for the emergence of the dependency theory was the crisis of orthodox Marxism in Latin America. Now, the Marxism was kind of crumbling. People were kind of not having faith in it. And why was they not having faith? Because of the bourgeois industrial revolution, which they could wage in proletariat socialist revolution, the kind of complete lapse of the socialist revolution. And therefore, like kind of what was happening in China and Cuba, it was evident that it was not possible to skip bourgeois revolution and go straight to socialist revolution. It was Marxism was losing attention. It was kind of creating ground for the breeding of the dependency theory of development. Now, when we look into the factors for the rise of dependency theory, the first factor is the failure of ECLE-CEPAL. Now, ECLA was a United Nations economic program. Now, by this time, there were a lot of kind of international organizations which came in, whose genesis is again in the Western context. And these international organizations, kind of United Nations, UNDP, World Organization, they became as kind of saviors, or they became the kind of organization that could help the third world country progress from underdevelopment to development. So, a number of programs, policies, projects were undertaken by this international organization to ensure the level of progress in the underdeveloped or third world country. So, ECLA was one of the programs of United Nations in Latin America. However, it kind of was not able to help the nation build the economy through development strategy of protectionism and industrialization through import substitution. So, what was given to these organizations was also a model that was followed by the Western country in order to ensure that their economy would be projected as something which was kind of perfect and had to be kind of, but all nations could not progress on the lines of development that was taking place in the Western countries. So, the programs of the UNDP failed, UN organization failed to combat the level of poverty, unemployment and political turmoil in Latin America. Economic and political problems were created, and this created a doubt on the policy of modernization theory. So, people started losing faith in the intellectuals, in the kind of academic discourse that was saying that modernization would take away the nation from underdevelopment and situation would improve. So, because of this economic social crisis in Latin America, we have a discourse that emerges, and that is the dependency theory. The third reason for the emergence of dependency theory is the decline of modernization in USA. So, in the 1960s, USA started witnessing anti-war protest, campus revolt, a large-scale social movement, the racial trouble, the emergence of racial consciousness, also the chronic inflammation, the devaluation of American dollar. At the same time, we also have social upliftment, the women's movement, the women liberation movement was at its peak, the struggle for civil rights was at this peak. So there were kind of a lot of debates and critique of the model of modernization in the USA. And this level of social unrest, they kind of caused radical social young scholars to rethink the idea of modernization. So large scale social problem, economic problem in America made it easier for the dependency theory which was emerging in Latin America to spread across and to kind of get legitimacy as a more suitable theory for understanding development. Imperialism, not backwardness, and lack of modernity was the new enemy in the United States. Now let us look into some of the thinkers or some of the key pioneers of the dependency theory. The first proponent or pioneer is Andre Gunder Frank, who kind of coined this school of dependency theory. And as already discussed, he opposed the internal explanation tactics used by modernization intellectual while dealing with the cause of underdevelopment in the developing countries. So according to Frank, it was underdevelopment of the colonial country was not only an internal factor, but it was also a large part played by the colonizers in kind of ruining the economy or kind of leading to the underdevelopment. So when we kind of not understand modernization by just putting blame on the internal factors alone, but rather external factors have contributed to the underdevelopment of the developing countries. Developing countries have experienced foreign domination, and we know, for that instance, when we read history of say the colonial rule in India, and there are large kind of understanding how in order to boost the process of industrialization, say instance to kind of give weightage to the textile industry, the cotton industry, the indigenous country in the India were kind of ruined. So the colonial rule itself can be considered as the factor that led to the deterioration of the economy. It's not only because of the social system or the cultural practice that it was kind of underdeveloped. So the colonial experience has drastically altered the path of development. So Frank formulated this concept of development of underdevelopment. So this is a very important phrase, development of underdevelopment. So it is kind of trying to understand the relation between the colonial colonizers and the colonial countries. So it was kind of also responding to the modernization theory that underdevelopment in the third world is kind of the result of the colonial rule, further kind of destructing the say home-based or cotton industry or the indigenous industry. So if it was kind of underdeveloped at one point of time, they further made it more go towards the lower level. His example, Frank used the example of China and India to kind of ensure that traditionalism was not necessarily, so the Indian economy was kind of characterized as a traditional economy, as a feudal economy, and the idea was that the traditional and feudal economy were not suitable for the becoming modern, or the kind of, they were contrasted to the modern. So the feudal would be society which was kind of more based on community labor, traditionalism in terms of more traditional modes of production, to the whole idea of moving towards technology, to more complex division of labor, to more kind of large scale production. So that was not necessarily the contrast. It was the colonial rule that instead of developing the economies of the colonized society, further ensured that they became more and more backward. Now there was a strategy. So the more the country could become underdeveloped, it would give more power, it could give more power to those who were kind of on the top. So the colonial colonizers would become politically, economically more powerful in terms of controlling the colonized society. The other concept that was given by Frank was metropolis stand, the difference between metropolis and satellite. Now, metropolises are cities which are found in the industrialized society. So, there was a shift from, say, rural peasant-based society to a kind of metropolis society, which would be more urban, which would be more individualism, more in terms of based on technology, and more in terms of large-scale production. The satellites were cities in the underdeveloping country. So, there is a kind of a relation between the metropolis and the satellite. And the argument by Frank is that there was an unhealthy relation. The colonizers were constructing or creating more and more metropolis, and the satellite cities were kind of constructed in order to ensure the flow of goods and services to metropolis. Western power during colonial domination built satellite cities in order to facilitate transferring of economic surplus to Western country. There was an unhealthy relationship between the metropolis and satellite, and at the same time it was kind of leading to development of the Western countries and underdevelopment of the third world countries. So both development and underdevelopment was taking place, but the key players were the Western countries. The second thinker which kind of help us to understand dependency theory is Theotonio das Santos. Now, according to Dos Santos, the economy of the dominant country. Now, who are the dominant country? Obviously, countries in the west or the north, which are kind of capitalist and industrialized. Now, the economy of these countries flourished at the cost of the underdeveloped country. So, economy were completely dependent on these, and what they did was they completely extracted or completely ruined the economy in the colonized country, and also because they had monopolistic control of the market, because they had political power, and also because of certain economic power, they were able to regulate the market trade relation, and even the flow of finance, the export of capital, the financial relations were all monopolistic, and therefore if we look into the flow of finance, it was moving from the developed countries to the more developed countries. For Dos Santos, dependent country, and who are the dependent country? Are the colonized country. It kind of, they were completely dependent for the economy on the Western country, and this limited the development of internal economy. The market could not develop, the technical and cultural capacity were limited, and this dependency on the Western or the developed country led to further underdevelopment of the colonized country. Now, Dos Santos gives three types of historical forms of dependencies. Now, one is colonial dependence, which we have kind of understood the colonial dependency, which was in terms of kind of completely dominance of the colonial countries on the economy, the political system, and to a large extent even the social cultural practice. So it is basically the process of colonization, which is kind of you have a complete monopoly of the social, economic, political conditions of the dependent country. And if we look into the history of colonization, we will understand how there was kind of a drain of wealth from the colonized country to the colonial countries. So the first dependency is financial industrial dependency. So according to Dos Santos, financial industrial dependency emerged at the 19th century. They were kind of completely dominated by the 19th century, the economy, the market, the industries, but rather the countries or the which were under the colonial rule, the production was also taking place for the market in the Western countries. Though they were labor working in the third world country, but it was all kind of exported to the Western country, and the same product which was manufactured in the third world was sent back at a higher cost, and that led to kind of a financial dependency. The third dependency is technological industrial dependence, and this is kind of also the idea that when there was a financial dependence, technology or moving towards a large scale industry would require a lot of finance. So if that finance was not available to the third world, it would obviously get dependent on the first world for supply of technology, for supply of high level industrial material and infrastructure for progress and development. So many of the underdeveloped countries began to experience industrial growth, but at a very slow pace, because even the pace of development was determined by the first world country. So some amount of development was seen, but this development was comparatively at a slower rate than that was taking place in the larger or the first world country. The third thinker, which becomes very important to understand dependency theory, is Samir Amin, and his work is Transition to Peripheral Capitalism. In his work, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, Samir Amin is talking about how the peripheral capitalism, that is capitalism in the country which was under the process of development, is dependent on the central capitalism. The central capitalism would be the level of economic growth in countries which have completely industrialized and transformed. So according to Amin, the central capitalism destroyed local craft without replacing them with the domestic industrial production. So the destruction of the local craft and local market was actually done in order to ensure that their market or the central capitalism flourished at a larger scale than the peripheral capitalism. So this transition to peripheral capitalism did harm to the economic growth of the developing nation, but some transition to center capitalism was the source of economic miracle to the Western nation. According to Amin, peripheral economies are characterized by distortion type of export known as extraversion. So he is giving us this whole idea of the hypertrophy of the tertiary sector, and he's kind of talking about how this cyclic flow of economy, which was argued by modernization theory, that there is a kind of equilibrium which prevents profit margin to increase. He is saying no, there are certain kind of destructive element which could be in terms of technology, which allows the certain sector of the economy or certain region to take profit, to take advantage of the profit, and therefore leads to monopoly capitalism. So when we look into the whole idea of the dependency theory, we can kind of summarize it by into 2 or 3 facts. One is that the Western nation never undergone a state of underdevelopment, so it cannot be evolutionary. What was portrayed was that the Western model is the model of modernization, and the third world country had to copy it. So then development is not evolutionary, because there was not a gradual process of progress in the developed countries. The second, dependency perspective studies unanimously that there is no such thing as economic evolution, and we know that the whole idea of linear evolutionism is outdated. It cannot help us to understand development. And if we were to understand development, we need to understand that there is a kind of idea of dependency on certain economy, which is the economy which have capitalism. So dependency studies affirm that the cause of underdevelopment in third world country is not by tradition, but by the theories of modernization which focus too much on technology and industry. So underdevelopment is not lacking progress, or it is the starting point of economic progress, but rather it is a condition triggered by economic and social structure established by capitalism. So in order to kind of conclude, it has been argued by the dependency theory that capitalism itself led to the development of the first world country and underdevelopment of the third world countries. With this understanding of dependency theory, we can have a more complete understanding of the economic model of development and its critique by the dependency theory. With this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.